Welcome to this week's episode of On Record PR. If you are a regular listener, welcome back. If you are joining us for the first time, I am Jennifer Simpson Carr, Vice President of Strategic Development at Furia Rubel Communications. And today I am here with our Executive Vice President, Sarah Larson. Hi, Sarah.
Hey, nice to see you again. Thanks for having me back.
Thank you for joining me again. So this episode is scheduled to release on Monday, June 16th. In last week's episode, Gina, our CEO and General Counsel, spoke with employment lawyer Eric Meyer to discuss the SCOTUS decision in Ames versus Ohio Department of Youth Services. So today we are diving into communications considerations for law firm leaders when Supreme Court decisions like these hit the news. What we'll talk about is how, when, and whether to communicate about these significant decisions with a focus on preserving trust, preventing misinformation, and reinforcing values. For those of you who are watching, I am fighting something. I'm sniffly, so if you see me mute or pause, just forgive me up front. I'll do my best.
I'm sure you'll be fine.
Thank you. So Sarah, Gina and I were at an industry event in New York last week when the Ames, Ohio decision hit the news. Given that we were networking among C-level executives in the legal industry, it became pretty quickly a significant topic of conversation during our lunch break, during networking sessions. So in this case, our initial understanding was that this decision or the case may be involving reverse discrimination, as many headlines reported, and a significant perceived threat to diversity, equity, inclusion, which is already feeling, the world is already feeling like that's under attack. So that's a lot to process at any point, but especially when you're a professional in the middle of the workday, you're trying to do good work and remain focused. So in these high stakes situations, a lot of times leaders may rush to react, especially when they are a firm who has a diverse group of employees, or they've been a firm who's really supported diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. So let's start at a foundational level. What is the very first thing law firm leaders should be thinking about when news like this breaks?
Sure. Well, we are hearing from a lot of our law firm leaders who are grappling with this, but frankly, Jennifer, I hope every leader of every organization everywhere listens to what I'm about to say next, because it's not just law firms, and frankly, it's not just leaders. I think all of us need to do a couple things. And the first thing is just pause. Take a break. Some backstory for me, for those of you who don't know me or haven't listened to some of my podcasts, I was a journalist before I moved into PR. I understand what drives these headlines. In today's online world, the headline gets the click. The headline is not there to educate you. The headline is there to either make you afraid, make you angry, and want to know more. That is literally its job. So take a minute, let that pass through your brain, and then say, okay, that's how this outlet is framing this decision, but let's go and learn a little bit more about what this actually means. Keep in mind too that the people who write headlines, you've sometimes got 5 words, 6 words, 7 words to get a headline on this piece. If you make a headline 25 words, you're not doing your job. So sometimes the nuance needs that amount of information. You're not going to be able to get it into a headline. So pause. Don't let this create anxiety and panic, not just in your employees, but also the leaders of the firms. When you want to communicate a message of strength and support, you need to take a minute and understand what's happening. So my first piece of advice is just pause, take a breath, gather your facts, talk to your internal team. If you have employment lawyers, undoubtedly they've been following this trend already, whether you as a firm offer employment services, so your lawyers are offering employment counsel, or your own employment counsel for yourself as an employer. Talk to them, talk to HR. HR has been following this stuff really, really closely. We are fortunate in this space and time to have a colleague on our team who is both a licensed attorney and a credentialed SHRM, Society of Human Resource Management. I think I got that right. And she has been, Elizabeth Ogilvie, and she has been fantastic the last few months following all these things for us and flagging things. Before you make any kind of statement, before you react to the headline, even just in a passing conversation in the hallway, you really need clarity on what it actually means and how it might impact or not impact your existing policies. So that first pause kind of helps ensure that whatever comes next is rooted in facts, aligned with your organization's values, and delivered in a way that helps support, not unsettle your employees. And please don't mistake me. I don't mean false positivity, right? There's a phrase, I think, toxic positivity. I am not talking about, everything's fine and then the axe falls. I'm talking about taking a breath, taking a minute, and going to find out what this actually means. Now, if you've been in a leadership role for several decades, the world has changed a lot. You don't have 6 weeks to convene a committee. You've got 6 hours. So you do still have to move quickly, but take a little pause. Does that help?
Yes, that's a great first place to start.
Yeah.
I think especially when you have empathetic leaders, you have leaders who want to lead with action. That pause is really important and sometimes forgotten. So you mentioned something really important I want to come back to. I have learned so much from you, from Becky Bergman, our director of media relations, from both of your backgrounds as journalists. And what you and a lot of surveys, have taught us at the agency is that with this new 24/7, 365 news cycle, are often gauged on, or their success is gauged on how much traffic their articles generate. And I share that because you explained earlier that they're short headlines, sometimes they incite fear or anxiety. And so from the reporter's perspective, I think it's helpful for someone who's never sat in those shoes to understand that getting clicks on their articles is oftentimes how their success is judged now, because so much is digital.
100%.
So
100%. We used to have a saying, and I think it probably is still true. If it bleeds, it leads. So the top fold of the newspaper, if you still read a newspaper, the top story on the nightly news, now it's 24/7, but is always going to be about conflict, confrontation, frankly, disaster, tragedy, and it gets exhausting. It gets absolutely exhausting. So understanding too that we live in that world, and sometimes you have to minimize your exposure to it, just for your own mental health. But then you raise your head back up again, and you see a headline like Supreme Court sides with woman claiming anti-straight job discrimination. And if you're a member of the LGBT plus community or an ally, you're like, what fresh HE double hockey sticks do we have here today?
So true.
It is.
It's so true. And it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is Gina and I at the conference trying to network and participate meaningfully, but also seeing these updates on our phones, which were very similar to what you shared. So I'm glad that we had Eric on last week to talk about what the decision actually means. But based on what we're talking about here with headlines and maybe sub headlines, they can feel a little bit misleading once you take the time to dig into the actual news or the report. So from a communication standpoint, how should law firm leaders approach the decision of when to speak up, what to say, and how to say it in a way that's thoughtful and doesn't feed into that fear or misinformation?
Yeah. So before we move on from that point to answer this question, I want to go back to something that you just said about the how they're judged on clicks. That's absolutely true. News organizations make their decisions on what to cover, what to send their crews to if you're going to go to cover something in person, what to publish online based on how many people are going to read it. So how can you affect that as a law firm leader? If you see a great feature on a really inspiring leader, share it. Share that link throughout your entire firm. Get more people to click on it. If you want good, you're going to get what you ask for through your actions. So if you want more good news, then you have to interact with the good news. Number one. Number two, we also had another saying that nobody writes a story about the cat that didn't get stuck up in the tree that day. The stories are always going to be about, oh my God, this just happened. here's what you need to know. But that here's what you need to know is always like the developing conversation. So, again, the reality is that these headlines are designed to get eyeballs on the story. The headline isn't the education. Unfortunately, as we have seen in the last few years, a great number of people, I'm not even going to hazard a guess as to what percentage, but a great number of people will never read the story. They form their entire understanding of an issue based on a headline, based on 6 words, based on their own confirmation bias. So I think from a leader standpoint, you have to remember, a lot of people are not going to go on their own and read it and figure out what it means. So if you want to set the tone and steer the narrative, you need to do that. You need to interpret it for them. You need to tell them what it means for your organization. So, we really want to acknowledge what's happening without amplifying it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So you want to take the time, you want to communicate with facts, reinforce your values. For example, I'm looking at my screen because I did jot this down. When that decision came out, we had some folks, including myself, who were like, okay, one more thing, like,
Yep,
what
here we
are
go
we going to do
again.
today? And reaching out to our folks who, our clients and our friends who are in the LGBTQ community, and just offering solidarity, because that was a really rough day for a lot of people. You might come up with a statement like, we're aware of the recent Supreme Court ruling in Ames versus Ohio, whatever. Trust me, there'll be another case you're going to want to respond to. So
insert name here.
Insert name here. While some headlines are causing confusion and fear, we want to assure you that our commitment to fair, inclusive, and merit-based practices remains unchanged. We're reviewing the decision closely and will continue to ensure that our policies here reflect both legal compliance and our firm's values. But for that to really ring true to your employees, to your audience, you have to already be living your values. And first, you have to know what those values are, and you have to act in concert with them. So, people will come to us and they'll want us to, tell me how to message this. Tell me how to message this thing. And sometimes I'm like, I can't until you tell me what you actually believe about it. I can make up anything, but your folks aren't going to believe it unless it aligns. Alignment is one of your favorite words, my friend, unless it aligns with your firm's values. So, ultimately, your role as a leader, as a communicator, it isn't just to inform. It's like a spotlight. Whenever you speak as a leader, you are shining a spotlight on that issue. And it's an opportunity to build trust and help reduce panic and help your people process these complex issues in a clear and calm way that affirms with your values.
So I'm going to use the word align again. So I'm hearing from you that alignment is key,
Yeah.
aligning messaging, aligning your values. So I think that's really helpful feedback for anyone, because I know you get these questions all the time, which is, what do we say? And I know that you and Gina say, let's take a step back. Who are you? What do you stand for? So I think that's critical. And I appreciate you kind of walking our listeners through that. Let's talk about the external brand and the external messaging. We know that, especially in recent years, law firm leaders have come under much more significant pressure from the outside of the law firm to take a position on world issues, social justice, politics, kind of global happenings, many of which don't even really intersect with the law, or impact the legal industry in some way. But in this case, a Supreme Court decision falls squarely in, the highest court of our country making a ruling like this falls squarely in the legal industry. So for the law firms that may feel pressure to take a stand or clarify their position externally, when, if ever, is it appropriate or necessary for a law firm to speak up publicly about a decision like Ames, and what factors should help guide that decision?
Sure. There's a lot of nuance to that question. Again, I hate to, it's like that relationship status. It's complicated. You really you have to really take a look at, again, who you are as a firm. If you're a corporate law firm with 10,000 employees, somebody in your internal audience is going to care about this. And even if it didn't intersect with the law, we're seeing a lot is made about generational shifts I think a lot of it is nonsense, but some of it's very true. I'm Gen X, and I'm very Gen X. But I'm sure you've seen the pieces about the younger Gen Z workers, and I guess Gen Alpha is going to be coming into the workplace soon. But even the millennials still, as they're moving into leadership roles, they care about, and not that Gen X didn't. Well, we kind of don't care, but we do. That's a whole nother story. They care a lot about the impact that their workplace, where they are choosing to invest their 40 to 80 hours a week, on the impact that their organization and their labor makes on the world. And so we get a lot of questions from older leaders who've been in leadership for a while, who are sort of like, I've never had to talk about this before. Why do they want me to talk about this? And you don't have to talk publicly about every single issue. You can't. You would never do anything else. There's a new issue every single day. We certainly would never encourage firms to spend all their day figuring out and sharing publicly what their response is to anything, including this decision. We all actually have other work to do. But there are some firms for whom this is, for whatever reason, relates so directly to who they are and what they do, that it does make sense for them to do that. So how do you sort of evaluate that? How do you decide what to do? First, you need to consider your audience. If you've got clients reaching out to you with questions about what this case means, are they in a position to be reading the headlines and misinterpreting them or misunderstanding how it might apply to their own policies? If the answer to that is yes, then coming up with a client alert or a blog post to explain what the decision means can be incredibly valuable. And we're seeing employment attorneys, this is your time to shine, people. We are seeing them respond to that really quickly with some of that guidance. But again, these are people who've been following this issue from the beginning. They understand the nuance, so they don't have to go figure it out. So side note, make sure you have somebody within your leadership team who is tasked at following some of these things to be ready to move when it comes. The second is to consider your own role in the conversation. Does it make sense to speak up? It might, if it's an opportunity to reinforce your firm's commitment to inclusive merit-based practices, or to offer practical legal guidance in this internally shifting landscape. If so, your message then should be grounded in legal clarity, but it also needs to reflect your firm's tone, your culture, and your brand voice. You also want to, thirdly, consider timing and tone. In the news business, unfortunately, today, it is often true that you don't need to be right, you need to be first. We want our law firm leaders to do the other side, right? We want to flip it. You don't have to be first, you do need to be right. So take the time to discuss it internally amongst your leadership team, decide, how this fits in and what this really means for your people. And then if you do decide you need to say something publicly, again, whether it's this decision or another one that's coming, something is coming or has happened recently that will affect the things that you, your team, your firm, your employees care about. So deciding whether to speak out, if you do decide to, please avoid the inflammatory language. Focus on what the decision means, what it doesn't mean. This is your opportunity to be a lawyer, not lawyerese, but like, okay, here's what this actually really means for the law. Here's how our firm is approaching this moment. So I hope that's helpful. Anytime you're going to speak externally, you really want your communications to be driven by your values, and you want them to be intentional. Performative, reactionary, that has gone out the window. People are too, I almost said cynical, but I don't think that's true. They're skeptical because I watch what you do, not just what you say. So what you say needs to align with what you do, and vice versa. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I'm big on show me, don't tell me.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's hitting the same mark.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Last question before we wrap up. And you and Elizabeth talked about this a bit when we last spoke a couple of weeks ago, but oftentimes when there's a communication decision being made, it's leadership in a room. And when I say leadership, oftentimes it's closed for executive committee members, practice group chairs, or whatever you call your leadership team. Who else needs to be part of this conversation when you're talking about communicating a message internally and externally?
Mm-hmm. HR, communications, the head of the communications department. If you and also I would say I understand that there are times when you need to restrict that kind of discussion to the top tier of leadership, but for both a succession planning standpoint and just an authenticity standpoint, it really makes sense for a lot of firms to bring in some younger folks who might not be up in those positions yet, but are influential, they're influencers within the firm. Because if you can get buy-in from the people who care most about this decision, you're going to be far more successful when you communicate it to others. So even just, having a trusted colleague to be like, hey, we've discussed this as a leadership team. This is where we think we're aligned. This is where we think we're landing. Here's the message that we're drafting. Would you just take a quick look at this and let me know? And obviously it has to be somebody that you trust to be, to have the firm's best interest in mind, and not then go screenshot that and share it with above the law. But but getting another perspective from somebody who may not be already up at the echelon of leadership is really, really valuable.
That's a great point. So I'm going to summarize very quickly what I heard from you for our listeners, which is whether it's a leader deciding how to speak to their team, whether it's addressing the broader public, the keys are to start with a pause, which I think is really critical and great advice, and then lead with clarity, consistency, and compassion.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely.
So thank you so much for joining me. I love the conversations with you. I always learn so much. We hope for our listeners that today's conversation has given you the tools you need to work through these complex issues. As Sarah mentioned, this was just an opportunity with a Supreme Court decision to talk about this issue, but it's really much more broad than just the Ames v. Ohio. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, share it with a colleague or a friend, and consider leaving a review on iTunes. Please continue to share your feedback and ideas with us at podcast@onrecordpr.com. We will see you again next week. And thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you, Jennifer. Take care.
This episode is brought to you by Furia Rubel Communications, a public relations and marketing agency serving law firms and businesses worldwide. With an expert team positioned throughout the U.S. and supported by an international faculty, Furia Rubel enhances our clients' brands through integrated communications by providing expert guidance in crisis management and high-profile litigation, protecting brand and reputation, and supporting internal marketing teams. To learn more, visit furiarubel.com. On Record PR is produced by Jennifer Simpson Carr and Matt Henderson, with support from the team at Furia Rubel Communications. This episode is edited by Isabel Horan and Christian Yamula. Visit www.onrecordpr.com for resources and more information.